These bear cubs want a hug every time the girl comes home. And you won't believe how they ask. The morning mist clung to the towering pines of Cedar Ridge Valley like a shroud, filtering the early Colorado sunlight into pale, ghostly beams. William Bill Crawford stood on his weathered porch, coffee mug in hand, watching the familiar dance of shadows across his property. At 69, his body carried the accumulated aches of 4 decades spent patrolling these very forests. But it was the weight in his chest that aged him most, a burden he'd carried for 40 years, as constant as the mountain air itself. The silence of his solitary life was broken only by the distant call of a hawk and the gentle creak of pine boughs swaying in the breeze. Bill preferred it this way. The fewer people around, the fewer chances for conversation, and the fewer chances someone might ask about his years as a forest ranger. There were stories he could tell, tales of rescuing lost hikers, fighting wildfires, and protecting the delicate ecosystem he devoted his life to preserving. But there was one story that would never pass his lips, one memory that haunted his dreams and made him instinctively step back whenever he glimpsed a bear silhouette in the distance. It had been a summer evening in 1984 when the call came in. A family camping near Willow Creek had been attacked by a mother black bear defending her cub. By the time Bill arrived, the scene was chaos, screaming children, a father with deep claw marks across his chest, and a mother bear standing protectively over her small cub, her eyes wild with maternal fury. Bill had tried everything, first noisemakers, warning shots into the air, even attempting to create a barrier between the bear and the family. But when the bear charged again, heading straight for the youngest child, a 6-year-old girl frozen in terror, Bill had no choice. The shot echoed through the forest like thunder. The mother bear dropped instantly, her massive body hitting the ground with a thud that seemed to shake the very earth. But it was what happened next that carved itself into Bill's soul forever. The cub, no bigger than a house cat, had approached its mother's still form, nudging her with its tiny snout, making soft mewing sounds that cut through Bill like a blade. When the cub finally looked up at him, those dark, confused eyes held an accusation that no amount of time could erase. Bill had done his job. He'd saved human lives. The family recovered. The incident was ruled justified, and his superiors commended his quick thinking. But none of that mattered when he closed his eyes at night and saw that orphan cub's gaze, or when he woke in cold sweats, hearing phantom cries echoing through his dreams. From that day forward, Bill kept his distance from bears, taking routes that avoided known denning areas and requesting assignments that kept him away from large predator corridors. He never spoke of that night to anyone, not to his colleagues, not to his late wife Margaret, not even to his own son. The years had passed in a blur of routine and solitude. Margaret's death from cancer 5 years ago had only deepened his isolation, and when his son David moved to California for work, Bill found himself truly alone for the first time in his life. He'd convinced himself that this was how it should be, that some people were meant to carry their burdens in silence, that some wounds were too deep to heal. But life, Bill was about to learn, had other plans. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning in late September. David's voice was strained, exhausted in a way that spoke of sleepless nights and difficult decisions. "Dad, I need to ask you something, and I know it's a lot." Bill had listened as his son explained the divorce, the custody battle, and the 12-year-old girl caught in the middle of it all. Emma needed a place to stay while the lawyers sorted everything out, somewhere stable and quiet where she could heal from the trauma of watching her parents' marriage implode. "She's been through hell, Dad," David had said, his voice breaking. "She blames herself for everything. The therapist thinks a change of environment might help. Somewhere away from all the fighting and lawyers and God, I don't know what else to do. Bill had agreed, of course. How could he not? But as he prepared the small guest room that had once been David's childhood bedroom, he wondered if he was the right person for this job. What did he know about healing a broken child when he couldn't even heal himself? Emma arrived on a gray October afternoon, stepping out of the social worker's car with a single duffel bag and eyes that seemed far too old for her 12-year-old face. She was small for her age, with dark hair that fell in tangled waves around her shoulders and a way of holding herself that suggested she was trying to take up as little space as possible. When Bill approached to help with her bag, she flinched away from his outstretched hand as if his touch might burn her. "Hello, Emma," he said gently, crouching down to her level. "I'm your grandpa, Bill. I'm glad you're here." She looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable, then walked past him into the house without a word. The social worker, a kind-faced woman named Mrs. Patterson, gave Bill an apologetic smile. "She hasn't spoken much since the custody hearing," she explained quietly. "The therapist says it's not uncommon. She's processing a lot of trauma." For the first 2 weeks, Emma moved through Bill's house like a ghost. She ate the meals he prepared in silence, did her homework at the kitchen table without making a sound, and spent most of her time in her room with the door closed. When communication was absolutely necessary, she wrote notes in careful, precise handwriting and left them where Bill would find them. "Thank you for breakfast. I finished my math homework. I'm not hungry for dinner." But it was the other notes that broke Bill's heart, the ones he wasn't supposed to see, crumpled up in her wastebasket or hidden under her pillow. "I'm a bad kid. Nobody wants to be near me. If I wasn't here, maybe Mom and Dad would be happy. I ruin everything I touch." Bill found himself walking on eggshells, afraid that any wrong move might send this fragile child deeper into her shell. He left her favorite snacks where she'd find them, bought books he thought she might like, and tried to create a routine that felt safe and predictable, but nothing seemed to reach her. At night, he could hear her crying through the thin wall, soft, muffled sobs that she tried to hide, even in her grief. He called David regularly, reporting on Emma's progress or lack thereof. But his son was dealing with his own demons. The divorce was getting uglier, with both parents using Emma as a weapon against each other. "She keeps asking when she can come home," David said during one particularly difficult conversation. "But I don't even know where home is anymore. Sarah and I can't be in the same room without screaming at each other." Bill wanted to help, wanted to find the right words or the perfect gesture that would unlock the door to Emma's heart. But he felt as lost as she did. How could he teach her to trust again when he'd spent 40 years building walls around his own heart? How could he show her that love was possible when he'd forgotten how to love himself? The answer, as it turned out, would come from the most unexpected source and would force Bill to confront the demons he'd been running from for 4 decades. It was a crisp November morning when Emma first ventured beyond the immediate vicinity of the house. Bill watched from the kitchen window as she walked toward the treeline, her small figure dwarfed by the towering pines. He'd been worried about her exploring alone, but the therapist had suggested that some independence might be good for her, and the forest around his property was relatively safe. Still, he kept one eye on her retreating form until she disappeared among the trees. Emma had always been drawn to abandoned places, to the forgotten corners of the world, where stories lingered like dust on old furniture. That's what led her to the rusted pickup truck, half hidden by undergrowth and decades of neglect. It was a 1950s Ford, its blue paint faded to the color of old denim, with vines growing through the broken windshield and moss covering the hood like a green blanket. She was examining the truck's interior, imagining the lives of the people who might have driven it, when she heard the sound. A faint, plaintive cry that seemed to come from within the vehicle itself. At first, she thought it might be a bird or a squirrel, but as she listened more carefully, she realized it was something else entirely, something that sounded almost like crying. The truck's passenger door was wedged shut by a fallen branch, thick as a man's arm and heavy with decay. Emma could see scratches around the door frame, deep gouges in the metal that looked like claw marks. Her heart began to race as she realized what she might be hearing. But instead of running away, she found herself moving closer. "Hello," she whispered, pressing her ear to the door. "Is someone in there?" The crying stopped for a moment, then resumed with renewed urgency. Emma looked around frantically, searching for something to help her move the branch. She found a sturdy stick and used it as a lever, throwing all her weight against it until the branch finally shifted enough for her to pull the door open. What she found inside took her breath away. 3 small black bear cubs, no bigger than puppies, huddled together in the truck's cab. They were thin, their fur matted and dull, and their eyes held a desperate hunger that Emma recognized all too well. The smallest one, a female with a white patch on her chest, looked up at Emma with an expression so vulnerable and trusting that it made her chest ache. Emma's mind raced as she tried to piece together what had happened. The scratches on the door, the way the cubs were trapped inside. Their mother must have been using the truck as a temporary den when the storm hit. Bill had mentioned a particularly bad windstorm a few weeks ago, strong enough to bring down several large trees. The branch must have fallen that night, trapping the cubs inside while their mother was out foraging. "She tried to get back to you," Emma whispered, understanding flooding through her. "She tried, but she couldn't open the door." The cubs looked at her with a mixture of fear and hope, their small bodies trembling with exhaustion and hunger. Emma knew she should probably run back to the house, tell her grandfather what she'd found, let the adults handle the situation. But something in their eyes stopped her, a recognition of abandonment that mirrored her own pain. "I won't leave you," she said softly, reaching out to touch the smallest cub's head. "I know what it feels like to be left behind." Emma's secret began that afternoon in Bill's old garage, a dusty space filled with forgotten tools and memories. She'd managed to coax the 3 cubs out of the truck with gentle words and patient movements, carrying them one by one to the safety of the garage. The largest cub, whom she immediately dubbed Buster for his playful attempts to wrestle with her shoelaces, seemed to recover his spirits quickly once he realized he was safe. The gentle female with the white chest patch became Belle. And the smallest, cleverest cub who seemed to study everything with intense dark eyes, she named Bandit. Emma had never cared for anything more helpless than herself, but instinct seemed to guide her actions. She created a nest of old blankets in the corner, found a plastic basin that she filled with warm water, and began the delicate process of nursing 3 starving bear cubs back to health. She mixed powdered milk with water, testing the temperature on her wrist the way she'd seen her mother do with baby bottles years ago, and fed them with an old turkey baster she'd found in Bill's kitchen drawer. The first night was the hardest. Buster developed a fever, his small body burning hot against Emma's chest as she held him close. She stayed awake all night, cooling him with damp cloths and whispering reassurances. She wasn't sure she believed herself. "I can't abandon them like my parents abandoned me," she murmured into his fur, the words slipping out before she could stop them. It was the first time she'd spoken aloud since arriving at her grandfather's house, and the sound of her own voice in the darkness surprised her. But the cubs didn't judge her for her words or her tears. They didn't ask her to explain herself or demand that she be someone she wasn't. They simply accepted her love with the pure, uncomplicated gratitude of creatures who had been saved from certain death. For the first time in months, Emma felt needed, felt like she had a purpose beyond being the broken child everyone whispered about. Bill noticed the changes immediately. Emma began eating more at meals, her cheeks gaining color that had been absent since her arrival. She started humming under her breath while doing her homework. And he caught her smiling at private jokes only she understood. But he also noticed other things, the way she disappeared for hours at a time, the strange sounds coming from the garage, and the mysterious disappearance of food from his pantry. When he finally confronted her about the noises, Emma's face went pale with fear. She stood in front of the garage door like a small sentinel, her arms spread wide as if she could physically block his entry. "Please don't go in there," she whispered, the first words she'd spoken directly to him since her arrival. "Please, Grandpa Bill. They need me." Bill's heart began to race, old fears rising like bile in his throat. "Emma, what's in there?" But before she could answer, he heard it, a soft chittering sound that he recognized immediately. His blood ran cold as memories of that night 40 years ago came flooding back. "Those wild animals are dangerous," he shouted, his voice harsher than he had intended. "Emma, get away from there right now." The look of betrayal on his granddaughter's face cut him deeper than any physical wound. She ran to her room and slammed the door, leaving Bill standing alone in the gathering dusk, his hands shaking with a mixture of fear and regret. That night, unable to sleep, Bill found himself drawn to the garage window. What he saw there stopped him in his tracks. Emma sat cross-legged on the floor, 3 small bear cubs arranged around her like petals on a flower. She was singing softly, a lullaby that Margaret used to sing to David when he was small, her voice sweet and clear in the darkness. The cubs were completely relaxed, their eyes drooping with contentment as they listened to her gentle melody. "She's treating them like her family," Bill whispered to himself, and the realization hit him like a physical blow. This wasn't about wild animals or danger. This was about a broken child trying to heal herself by healing others. Emma had found creatures even more abandoned than herself, and in caring for them, she was learning to care for herself again. Bill stood at that window for a long time, watching his granddaughter create the family she'd been denied. When he finally went back to the house, he made a decision that would have seemed impossible just hours before. Despite every instinct screaming at him to call animal control, despite the nightmares that would surely follow, he was going to help Emma save those cubs. The next morning, Emma found a bag of high-quality powdered milk in her unlocked cabinet, along with vitamins and a book about caring for orphaned wildlife. When she looked at Bill with questioning eyes, he simply shrugged and said, "Must have been left over from when your father was small." Over the following weeks, Bill found himself becoming an invisible partner in Emma's rescue mission. He called the local veterinarian, Dr. Patricia Martinez, claiming he had a friend who needed advice about caring for bear cubs. He installed a ventilation window in the garage and reinforced the floor with warmer boards, always with an excuse ready when Emma asked about the improvements. "Just fixing things up," he'd say, "old buildings need maintenance." But it was the transformation in Emma that truly amazed him. As the cubs grew stronger under her care, she began to blossom as well. She started talking again, first to the cubs and then gradually to Bill himself. She created elaborate schedules and routines, treating the cubs like the siblings she'd never had. "Buster is the naughty big brother," she explained to Bill one afternoon, her eyes bright with affection as she watched the largest cub attempt to climb into a bucket of water. "He's always getting into trouble, but he doesn't mean any harm. Belle is the gentle little sister. See how she always makes sure everyone gets fed before she eats. And Bandit is the clever second brother. He figures out how to open latches and remembers where I hide the good treats." Emma's family schedule became the structure around which her entire day revolved. Morning toothbrushing involved all four of them lined up in front of the garage mirror with the cubs holding wooden brushes in their paws, while Emma demonstrated proper technique. "Our family must be clean," she would announce solemnly. And somehow the cubs seemed to understand the importance of the ritual. Lunch was a formal affair with everyone sitting around a checkered cloth that Emma had spread on the garage floor like a proper dining table. She served each cub their portion of milk and berries with ceremonial precision, always saying, "In a family, no one goes hungry." The cubs learned to wait for her signal before eating, their dark eyes fixed on her face with devoted attention. Afternoon homework time was perhaps the most endearing ritual of all. Emma would sit with her school books while the three cubs arranged themselves around her, each with one of Bill's old volumes propped open in front of them. Bandit took his studies particularly seriously, using his claws to scratch marks in the dirt that he seemed to believe were actual writing. Belle would sniff each page of her book carefully, occasionally nodding as if she understood the content, while Buster inevitably tried to eat whatever reading material was closest to him. "Knowledge must be absorbed," Emma would say with mock seriousness when she caught Buster chewing on her math book. And Bill had to bite his lip to keep from laughing out loud. The cubs' attempts to help with household chores provided endless entertainment and chaos. The mini-chef squad turned every cooking session into a disaster zone, with Buster insisting on adding increasingly bizarre ingredients to whatever Emma was preparing. One memorable afternoon, Bill watched through the window as Buster proudly presented one of Bill's old socks as a secret ingredient for the cubs' afternoon snack. "Buster, Grandpa's sock is not a seasoning," Emma squealed. But her laughter filled the garage with warmth that Bill hadn't heard in his home for years. Belle appointed herself the head chef, wearing one of Bill's old wool caps as a chef's hat and conducting her brothers with regal gestures of a wooden spoon. She would stand on her hind legs, swaying like a ballet dancer, completely absorbed in her role as the family's culinary director. Meanwhile, Bandit would quietly steal ingredients and retreat to a corner to sample them, always pretending to be asleep when caught, even with evidence of his crime still clutched in his paws. The laundry army was equally ambitious and equally disastrous. The cubs' idea of helping Emma wash clothes involved dunking everything in the nearby pond and then drying the items by rolling around on them in the grass. Bill nearly choked on his coffee the morning he saw Buster attempting to wear one of Emma's floral dresses, the pink fabric stretched over his growing frame as he stumbled around the yard like a furry, confused fashion model. But it was the quiet moments that touched Bill most deeply. When Emma struggled with a particularly difficult homework problem, all three cubs would tilt their heads toward her paper with expressions of genuine concern, as if they truly understood her frustration and wanted to help. When she cried missing her parents, they would form a protective circle around her, with Buster resting his head on her chest, Belle gently licking away her tears, and Bandit holding her hand with surprising gentleness. One evening in December, Bill watched Emma organize what she called an adoption ceremony for the cubs. She had found ribbons in Margaret's old sewing box and tied them around each cub's neck like formal collars. Standing before them with the solemnity of a judge, she declared, "From today, you are officially my family. I will never abandon you, no matter what happens." The cubs seemed to sense the importance of the moment, sitting perfectly still as Emma spoke her vows. When she finished, they pressed close to her, their warm bodies creating a huddle of unconditional love that made Bill's chest tight with emotion. As winter deepened, Emma's confidence grew along with the cubs. She began calling her parents regularly, telling them about her bear family with an enthusiasm that had been missing from her voice for months. "They don't judge me," she explained to Bill one evening. "They don't care that Mom and Dad got divorced or that I'm not perfect. They just love me because I'm me." The turning point came on a particularly cold January night when Emma developed a high fever. Bill found her in the garage, delirious and shivering, with all three cubs pressed against her body, trying to keep her warm. For the first time since the cubs' arrival, Bill stepped fully into the garage, kneeling beside his granddaughter and feeling her burning forehead with a trembling hand. "They truly love you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Just like I do. Now we are all a family." Emma's fever broke the next morning, but something fundamental had shifted in their relationship. She began including Bill in her stories about the cubs, and he found himself drawn deeper into their daily routines. He started standing closer to the garage door during Emma's evening storytelling sessions, eventually stepping inside to listen as she spun tales of brave animal families who overcame impossible odds through love and loyalty. "A family that loves each other must be gentle," Emma said one night as she demonstrated the proper way to hug a bear cub without causing harm. Bill watched her small hands move with practiced care, and he understood that she wasn't just teaching the cubs, she was teaching herself how to love and be loved without fear. One stormy night in February, Bill saw Emma carrying all three cubs into her bedroom because she was worried they'd be cold in the garage. "Family must stay together when things get tough," she whispered as she settled them on her bed. And Bill realized that his granddaughter was living the values she'd been denied, creating the stability she'd never experienced. The cubs were growing rapidly now, their playful antics taking on more strength and purpose as they approached their first birthday. Dr. Martinez, who had been providing advice through Bill's carefully worded phone calls, finally insisted on seeing the cubs in person. Her visit was a revelation. The cubs were healthy, well socialized, and clearly bonded to Emma in a way that was both touching and remarkable. "I've never seen anything like it," Dr. Martinez told Bill privately. "These cubs should be wild and fearful of humans, but they're completely trusting. That little girl has given them something extraordinary, a sense of security that most orphaned wildlife never experience." But with the cubs' growth came difficult questions about their future. They couldn't stay in the garage forever, and as they matured, their needs would become more complex. Bill found himself researching wildlife sanctuaries and rehabilitation programs, his heart heavy with the knowledge that Emma would eventually have to say goodbye to the family she'd created. It was during one of these research sessions that Emma found him at his computer, reading about bear sanctuaries with tears in his eyes. She climbed onto his lap, something she hadn't done since she was very small, and studied the screen with serious eyes. "They'll have to leave eventually, won't they?" she asked quietly. Bill nodded, unable to trust his voice. Emma was quiet for a long moment, then surprised him with her next words. "Grandpa Bill, why are you so afraid of bears?" The question hung in the air between them like a challenge. Bill had spent 40 years avoiding this moment, but looking into Emma's trusting eyes, he realized that some secrets were too heavy to carry alone. Slowly, haltingly, he told her about that night in 1984, about the mother bear and her cub, about the choice he'd had to make, and the guilt that had haunted him ever since. Emma listened without judgment, her small hand resting on his arm as he spoke. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time, processing his words with the gravity of someone far older than her 12 years. "You saved people," she said finally. "You did what you had to do to protect a family. That doesn't make you a bad person, Grandpa. It makes you brave." "But that cub would have died anyway if its mother had killed those people," Emma interrupted gently. "You couldn't save everyone, but you saved who you could. Now it's our turn to save them." She gestured toward the garage where the 3 cubs were probably napping in their nest of blankets, safe and loved and completely unaware of the profound healing taking place in the house nearby. That night, for the first time in 40 years, Bill entered the garage without fear. He knelt beside Bandit, the cleverest of the 3 cubs, and slowly extended his hand. The young bear sniffed his fingers curiously, then gently rested his head against Bill's palm. It was a gesture of complete trust, of forgiveness for sins the cub couldn't even comprehend. And Bill felt something inside his chest finally begin to heal. "I'm sorry," he whispered, though he wasn't sure if he was apologizing to Bandit, to the long-dead mother bear, or to himself. "I'm so sorry." Emma knelt beside him, her small hand covering his larger one where it rested on Bandit's head. "Love doesn't have boundaries," she said softly. "It just needs a heart big enough to hold it all." Spring brought new challenges and new possibilities. Emma's parents, inspired by their daughter's transformation, began working with a counselor to rebuild their relationship. The divorce was finalized, but they were learning to co-parent with respect and cooperation rather than anger and blame. Emma's confidence continued to grow, and she began talking about becoming a veterinarian, inspired by her experience caring for the cubs. The cubs themselves were approaching a size where they could no longer be safely housed in the garage. After extensive research and consultation with Dr. Martinez, Bill made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. He applied for permits to create a proper wildlife sanctuary on his property, complete with secure enclosures and professional-grade facilities. "If we're going to do this," he told Emma, "we're going to do it right." The construction took most of the summer, with Emma supervising every detail to ensure her siblings would be comfortable in their new home. The cubs seemed to understand that changes were coming, but they adapted with the resilience that had carried them through their early trauma. On Emma's 13th birthday, the sanctuary was officially completed. The 3 bears, now approaching adult size but still gentle and trusting with their human family, moved into their spacious new enclosure with a mixture of excitement and curiosity. Emma spent the entire day with them, helping them explore their new territory and reassuring them that this wasn't goodbye, it was just the next chapter in their story. That evening, as Bill and Emma sat on the porch, watching the bears play in their new home, Emma leaned against her grandfather's shoulder with a contentment that had been missing from her life for so long. "Do you know what I realized?" she said softly. "What's that, sweetheart?" "I spent so long thinking I was broken, thinking I was the reason my parents couldn't love each other. But Buster and Belle and Bandit taught me something important. Love isn't about being perfect or never making mistakes. It's about showing up even when things are hard. It's about choosing to care for someone even when they can't care for themselves." Bill felt tears prick his eyes as he looked at this remarkable young woman who had somehow found wisdom in the midst of her pain. "You saved them, Emma. but I think they saved you, too. They saved all of us, she corrected gently. Even you, Grandpa. I see the way you look at them now, without fear. They helped you forgive yourself. 5 years later, Emma Crawford stood in the sanctuary she and her grandfather had built together, now expanded to house not just Buster, Belle, and Bandit, but several other rescued bears as well. At 17, she was already accepted to veterinary school, her future bright with purpose and possibility. Her parents, who had indeed reconciled and remarried, visited regularly, marveling at the young woman their daughter had become. Bill, now 75, moved more slowly than he once had, but his eyes held a peace that had been absent for decades. The sanctuary had become his life's work, a way of giving back to the species he had once feared. He and Emma worked together daily, caring for their growing family of rescued bears with a dedication that inspired everyone who met them. On Bill's 75th birthday, the 3 original bears seemed to sense the importance of the occasion. They brought gifts from the forest, wildflowers clutched gently in their massive paws, berries saved from their morning feeding, and smooth stones that caught the light like jewels. Emma laughed as she accepted each offering, translating their bear language for the assembled family members. Buster says the flowers are because you always make sure we have fresh water, she announced solemnly. Belle wants you to know that the berries are the sweetest ones she could find. And Bandit, she paused as the largest of the 3 bears approached Bill directly, his massive head lowering to rest gently against the old man's chest. Bandit says, "Thank you for giving us a home." Bill's hands shook as he stroked Bandit's thick fur, remembering the terrified cub he'd been afraid to touch just 5 years before. "Thank you for giving me a family," he whispered back. As the sun set over Cedar Ridge Valley, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Emma placed her hand on her grandfather's shoulder and smiled. "Do you know what I figured out, Grandpa?" "What's that, sweetheart?" "You didn't just give me a place to heal. You gave me the biggest family in the world. And the best part is, it keeps growing." Bill looked around at the sanctuary they'd built together, at the bears who had taught them both how to love without fear, at the family that had grown from the ashes of their separate pain. For the first time in 40 years, he felt completely at peace with the choices he'd made and the life he'd lived. Love, he realized, truly had no boundaries, it just needed a heart wide enough to hold it all. And thanks to a broken little girl and 3 orphaned bear cubs, he found it.